You think modern dating is hard? Try marrying someone you've never met. At the age of 12, you're just starting to figure out life. Maybe you've picked up some herbal knowledge from your gran. Maybe you're learning to sew or help your father in the fields. A medieval wedding was a legal transaction. Most marriages were confirmed just by mutual consent and followed by, well, sex. If you were a woman, especially a noble one, your body became a battlefield. You were expected to bear heirs, and quickly. If you didn't, people assumed you were cursed, sinful, or simply a waste of a good dowry. And it wasn't just about having kids, it was about having sons. Husbands had the right to correct their wives, which included beatings, so long as they didn't kill them. Just herbal remedies, prayers, and the hope that the local midwife knew what she was doing. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women. And after giving birth, you'd go right back to work cooking, cleaning, managing the household, and preparing for the next pregnancy. What happened when love turned into accusation, when a spouse disappeared, or when one partner dared to seek out something forbidden? Because in the Middle Ages, a bad marriage wasn't just painful, it could be fatal. Babies came fast and often, and most didn't survive. Losing children was common, expected even, and mourning had to be quiet and brief. You weren't supposed to fall apart. You were supposed to get back to the grind because survival didn't wait for grief. Think about that. You could be beaten in your home with no recourse because it was considered your husband's moral duty to keep you in line. In some places, people believed a good beating helped preserve family harmony. Abuse wasn't hidden, it was woven into the very structure of marriage. And if you tried to run, you were considered a fugitive. If caught, you might be dragged back, punished, or even imprisoned. For women in bad marriages, there was no escape. The pressure to produce a male heir wasn't a cute plot in a costume drama. It was everything. Fail to do it, and your husband might set you aside, seek an annulment, or simply take mistresses. Maybe you both liked cider and had a shared hatred of geese. Even then, the world didn't make it easy. Plagues came and wiped out whole families. Lords demanded taxes that stripped homes bare. Famine reduced communities to desperation. And if either of you died, which was likely, the other was thrown into a new cycle of negotiations, remarriage, or worse. Widows were especially vulnerable. Some were forced into convents. Others were married off again by relatives who wanted to use them as bargaining chips. Your life was never really your own. It was a transaction wrapped in rituals and forced smiles. That's if you were lucky. In some places, women accused of infertility were subject to rituals, public humiliation, or worse. That was the real seal of the deal. You'd go to the priest, say, "I do." If you were a peasant man, you needed a wife to help tend the land, manage animals, raise children, and keep your small household alive. But if anything happened to your crops, your livestock, or your health, your whole family could starve. The stakes were high, and stress was constant. If you were a nobleman, your marriage was likely political. Your wife was a strategic alliance, not a soulmate, and any tenderness you felt had to survive a world of betrayals, shifting loyalties, and castle intrigue. Getting married meant giving up privacy, choice, and often freedom. And then the whole village might walk you to your new home. They had legal codes spelling out what each person was allowed to do. Women were under the authority of their husbands in almost everything: money, land, even movement. A married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed by her husband's. This concept, called coverture, meant that you literally didn't exist in the eyes of the law. Want to buy something? Can't. Want to leave? Good luck. Want to say no to your husband? That wasn't even a question people asked. Marital rape wasn't a crime because it wasn't considered possible. In the eyes of the church and society, a wife owed her husband obedience and conjugal duty. No exceptions. In wealthier families, it got weirder. Nobles had bedding ceremonies where the wedding guests escorted the couple to the bedroom, made jokes, sang songs, and sometimes watched them get into bed together. This wasn't some Game of Thrones fantasy. It was social proof that the marriage was valid and consummated. Yes, really. Imagine your aunt watching you undress with a mug of ale in hand. Welcome to married life. And then boom, your parents tell you you're getting married next week. To who? A 30-year-old man with land. Or a blacksmith with debts. Or your cousin. Doesn't really matter. You don't get to choose. The church had rules about marriage age technically. It was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but no one was checking IDs. What mattered was property, dowries, and making sure your family didn't end up socially irrelevant. Love? That was a happy accident if it ever showed up, and usually didn't. And being expected to make it work while also managing a plague, famine, and your mother-in-law trying to poison you. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival, land deals, alliances, and wounds. Mostly wounds. If you were a noble woman, your uterus was basically your entire resume. If you were a peasant, marriage was your ticket to economic survival, and your husband was probably the guy in the next hut, over with 3 teeth and a drinking problem. Either way, your chances of dying in childbirth were high. Your rights were low, and divorce wasn't just frowned upon, it was practically sorcery. Let's say you're a 15-year-old girl in 13th century England. Once the match was arranged, the next hurdle was the wedding. But don't picture a white dress and a reception with chicken and dancing. And married life in the Middle Ages? It was brutal. Men didn't have it easy either. Marriage meant responsibility, taxes, and war obligations. And don't even get us started on gender roles. Modern couples argue about chores. Medieval couples? And let's not forget about violence. It wasn't just tolerated, it was legally permitted. Now imagine getting pregnant in this environment. No doctors, no hospitals. But let's say somehow you and your spouse actually got along. Maybe there was laughter. That's just the beginning. And we haven't even touched on what happened when things really went wrong, when suspicion, betrayal, or scandal entered the marriage. Let us say your marriage hit a rough patch, which in medieval terms meant anything from a dried-up dowry to accusations of witchcraft. Maybe your husband vanished during a crusade. Maybe your wife refused to have children. For women, being accused of adultery could mean public shaming, exile, or death. In some regions, if a married woman was caught with another man, her nose could be cut off. The Catholic Church, which dominated Europe, didn't believe marriage could be undone. If a woman was accused of being a witch or sleeping with a priest, the whole community could turn on her. She might be paraded through the streets, beaten or drowned. If a man was caught in a scandal, say, with a servant girl or stealing from his wife's dowry, he might be flogged, fined, or forced to stand in public stocks while people threw rotten vegetables at him. Too much pleasure? Sin. Too often? Sin. On certain days, definitely sin. During Lent, major sin. Certain positions. Sign again. A woman couldn't own land, enter contracts, or defend herself in court without her husband's permission. If she committed a crime, he was held responsible. If he committed a crime against her, the court often shrugged. And if a husband died, the widow was often stripped of property and married off again quickly, and without her say, because widows with land were valuable. And in the Middle Ages, women weren't allowed to be valuable for long. The idea was that sex was a necessary evil, tolerated only to produce children. Imagine being newly married and constantly second-guessing whether tonight as intimacy would land you in confession or hellfire. Because in this world, even if you survived the wedding and the childbirth and the gossip and the war and the famine, marriage wasn't a refuge. It was a battlefield. The medieval church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a marriage referee, whispering rules into your bedroom and controlling your conscience. Medieval justice didn't believe in subtlety. It was brutal, public, and permanent. One mistake and your entire marriage and life could unravel in front of your neighbors. It was a sacrament, indissoluble, your best hope, an annulment. But annulments weren't easy. And how did people know if you consummated it? Sometimes the bedsheets were inspected. Infant mortality was sky high. 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. And those who survived were often promised into marriages of their own before they even hit puberty. Marriage arrangements were made over dinner. Your toddler could be engaged before they could speak. And if your child was a daughter, the cycle started over. Dowries had to be negotiated. Virginity had to be protected. Alliances had to be maintained. You didn't just marry a person, you married their future, their land, their lineage, and all the political baggage that came with it. Really, noble families especially wanted proof that their daughter was a virgin and that the marriage was legitimate. Blood on the sheets was considered evidence. No blood, no deal. It was invasive, humiliating, and had absolutely nothing to do with science or consent. It was about control. Your body wasn't yours. It belonged to the marriage contract. You had to prove that the marriage was never valid in the first place. Maybe you were too young, too closely related, or it was never consummated. And even then, only the church could decide, and the process took years. Nobles sometimes bought annulments with money and influence. Everyone else, they stayed miserable, or they ran away, or they died, literally. It was called nose-cutting punishment, and it was meant to destroy her beauty and her reputation in one slice. In the eyes of the law, she had violated her husband's property, because that's what a wife was, property. For men, affairs were more common and often overlooked, especially if they were nobles or kings. But even they weren't immune to trouble if their dalliances led to political embarrassment or illegitimate heirs. Maybe someone in your village whispered that your partner had been seen talking to someone they shouldn't tea. Now what? In the Middle Ages, there was no marriage counseling. There was no, we just grew apart. There were only consequences, and they were ugly. Infidelity, that wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. And if your spouse just disappeared, tough luck. There was no missing person hotline. You were supposed to wait. For how long? Sometimes 7 years, sometimes never. Abandonment was hard to prove, and remarriage was legally risky. You could be accused of bigamy, a sin so serious it could lead to excommunication or worse, execution. If you married again before the church said it was okay, and your old partner came back, you could be put on trial, publicly humiliated, or punished severely. For some unlucky folks, a spouse returning from war or a distant pilgrimage wasn't a joyous reunion. It was a legal and religious nightmare. Even if you wanted to end the marriage for legitimate reasons, abuse, infertility, abandonment, you were stuck. Divorce, as we know, it didn't exist. And let's not forget about scandal. Gossip in a medieval village could spread faster than fleas. Even your wedding night wasn't safe from judgment. If you failed to consummate the marriage, the union could be annulled. Let's say you had kids. Congratulations, but don't get too attached. The church had its own opinions about married life. You were allowed to have sex, but only within marriage and only for reproduction. Meanwhile, the law gave men near total control over their wives. Still think you could hack it in a medieval marriage? Hold on, there's still more. The rituals, the inheritance games, the in-laws, the plagues that tested every vow you ever took. Now imagine you're a few years into your medieval marriage. You're not dead yet. Congratulations, but you're probably tired. Tired from the kids, tired from trying to keep the house warm with firewood that smokes more than it heats. Tired from hiding your good shoes during raids. Tired from pretending you're not miserable. But more than anything, you're tired from the constant pressure. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage didn't just belong to the couple. It belonged to everyone. Your priest, your neighbors, your king, even your ancestors had a say in what your marriage should look like. It was never just about love. It was about survival, reputation, and duty. And heaven forbid you didn't have children. No heirs meant disaster. For nobles, it meant dynasties collapsing, land being seized, or thrown into bloody succession disputes. For peasants, it meant no one to pass the farm to, no one to help harvest, no one to care for you in old age. Infertility, of course, was always blamed on the woman. Even if the husband was 63 and riddled with war injuries, society pointed fingers at the wife. She might be pressured into prayer pilgrimages, herbal remedies, or even exorcisms. In some places, women were expected to bathe in sacred wells or drink potions blessed by monks, none of which worked, but all of which reinforced the belief that she was broken. Meanwhile, if a man couldn't produce children, it was called God's mysterious will. Go figure. Let's talk in-laws, because no medieval marriage was complete without them. Marrying someone meant marrying their entire family, whether you liked it or not. Fathers-in-law often retained legal rights over your land, while mothers-in-law might move into your home and assume control of household decisions. There was no just block them option. You couldn't escape them unless they died, or you did. Sometimes both. In noble families, marriages were used to seal truces between enemy clans, meaning you might be married to someone whose relatives literally killed yours last winter. Family reunions were less cheese board and hugs, and more dagger under the table and passive-aggressive prayers. And then there was the plague, or the famine, or the war. At some point in your marriage, something big and terrible would sweep through your village. Maybe you'd wake up to find half your neighbors dead from the Black Death. Maybe your crops failed for the 3rd year in a row. Maybe your husband got conscripted into a war against people you've never heard of in a country you'll never see. Life expectancy was low, around 35 years, if you were lucky. You weren't planning retirement with your spouse, you were hoping to make it past your next birthday. Marriage vows were short because people didn't last long. And yet, people still got married. They still made it work, somehow. They still laughed during feasts, danced during harvest festivals, and whispered to each other in candlelit rooms. Because even though marriage in the Middle Ages was brutal and complicated and often unfair, it was also one of the few ways people could build a kind of life in a world that didn't promise much. For every arranged match, there were a few couples who defied the odds and married for love. For every oppressive rule, there was a whispered rebellion. For every cruel fate, there was some version of hope. But make no mistake, if you tried to swap your modern relationship for a medieval one, you wouldn't last. You wouldn't survive the ceremonies, the customs, the expectations, or the consequences. Your texting habits wouldn't help. Your need for boundaries would be seen as rebellion. Your ideas of partnership would be laughed at by a monk while he dunked you in cold river water to cast out the demon of disobedience. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about feelings. It was about function. It was a legal contract, a political agreement, a survival strategy, and a religious duty. Love wasn't required. Endurance was. So know your modern love story with date nights and matching hoodies and shared Spotify playlists wouldn't survive one day in the smoky, prayer-filled, drafty halls of a medieval marriage. You'd miss your independence. You'd miss your voice. You'd miss your safety. But most of all, you'd miss being seen as a person instead of a property. And that, more than anything, is why you wouldn't survive marriage in the Middle Ages.